Well, this week we began reading through Ezra, and before the week is over, we will be in Nehemiah. Now, originally, these two books were considered as one work. Both books were made up of a collection of various correspondences, like the letters that are sent to the kings concerning the rebuilding and so forth, but also the memoirs of Ezra and of Nehemiah. Now, notice also that much of the narrative is presented in the first person. So sometimes you'll read, this is what happened to this person, that person, then you'll read it in the first person. So that indicates that some of this information was all written down firsthand by Ezra and Nehemiah and then was incorporated into the greater part of the narrative. Now, as you're reading along, something I just want to mention, just in case, because there could be some confusion, maybe there already is. Something I wanted to mention is that there are several chronological issues with Ezra, especially, and I'm not saying that there's some problem with the chronology that makes us think that maybe it's not reliable, but not everything is reported in chronological order. This is why the narrative jumps around a lot, like from King Cyrus to Darius to Artaxerxes, back to Darius, and then back to Artaxerxes. You start, as you're reading through, it's like, okay, well, this letter went, and then the days of this king, this letter went out, and then these people said this, and then this king, and you start going, my goodness, who's king? It's jumping around. Well, the thing is that the writer was really not concerned with chronology, and so it can just be very, very easy to get lost and get confused as to, okay, well, who's king at this point? Because it seems like, we go from Cyrus issuing the edict, and all of a sudden, there's people opposing it, and there's another king saying stop within just a few pages. So that's something to bear in mind, is that chronology is not always something that the biblical writers were concerned with. So that's just a side note. But the book covers the return of the exiles and the struggle that they faced and encountered to rebuild the city and rebuild the temple and rebuild the nation and reestablish true worship. Both books make the case that the restoration efforts under Ezra and Nehemiah needed to be supported and also needed to continue. And most importantly, both books make the case that God is the one who has decreed the restoration and will therefore be with his people as they carry out his will. So obviously that they were facing lots of opposition. And so that was expected to continue. And so part of the purpose of these books was to say, look, you're going to encounter these things just as the people who first came back encountered these problems. Don't give up. Keep going. But imagine being among those who returned. The city's in ruins. There's no infrastructure. Plus, all the people around you hate you and are opposed to you and are opposed to what you're doing there, rebuilding the temple. It seems that at every turn there's opposition to the rebuilding effort. The tendency then to put down your tools and refrain from doing any work just to get along with the outsiders is very real. The people also were very vulnerable to attack and all kinds of other risks every day. And so it's no wonder then that some of the people opted to remain in exile, because you want us to go back to Judah and rebuild the temple? That sounds hard. It sounds very hard. And indeed, it was. Now, what is happening here in Nehemiah and Ezra in these books is not all that different than what we've been called to do as Christians. Now, just to give you sort of a big picture here, the restoration period that we're looking at now in these books is really, in a lot of ways, a microcosm of the broader narrative of the entire Bible. And the entire Bible narrative could be broken down into 4 parts: creation, fall, redemption, and then restoration as the final. So sin brought destruction to the city of God, and the people were exiled. Brought destruction to Jerusalem and to the nation of Judah, which is very similar to what happened with Adam and Eve. They were expelled from the Garden of Eden because of their sin. So now the Jews are being called back to the same place to rebuild in order that the name of the Lord might be great among the nations. And what is our calling as Christians? Our calling as Christians is really no different, right? Because just as the exiles were called back to restore the city, restore worship, so we as Christians have been called out of darkness into the light of Christ, and we've been commissioned to rebuild the city for God. We are called to make a difference in this world, to rebuild the ancient ruins of this world that we live in. See, this world is broken down and it's been devastated. And so we are called to roll up our sleeves and to get busy, get dirty, doing the work of reform and renewal in a devastated and broken down world. Now, both Ezra and Nehemiah are godly men who make great sacrifices, great personal sacrifices as well, and took great risks to do what they did. Like Nehemiah, for example, was the cupbearer to the king. And so he had a wonderful job and career. And that could have been something he did for many years afterwards. And yet he left all that behind in order to go and do something harder, to go and rebuild the walls of the city. And so Ezra and Nehemiah inspire us to do the same. They inspire us to be willing to sacrifice and to take risks for the glory of God. Now, of course, the stories reveal that the process was full of tremendous challenges. The process of rebuilding was not simple, was not easy. In fact, it took a long time. And so often the challenges caused the people to sort of forget and even throw the towel in and just sort of give up on the process. And so often they were tempted with that, even if they didn't give in. And this is why it took almost 20 years for the Second Temple to be rebuilt. And probably half of that time, nothing was happening. You see, what was taking place, of course, was all the opposition led to letters being written to the king, of course, a different king than Cyrus, the one who issued the decree in the first place. It says, and so the other kings didn't know anything about this decree. And so they tell them to stop, and so there's all these delays to the construction efforts. But eventually, they start forgetting about what they're there for, and they kind of just abandon the process altogether. They just start becoming very gloomy about the prospect of the work ever being completed. Now, two prophets are mentioned in Ezra, Haggai and Zechariah, and we have their prophetic writings as well in the Bible. In the book of Haggai, Haggai challenged the people with their priorities. There in verse 4, Haggai 1:4, when he says, "Is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your own paneled houses while this house lies in ruins?" You see, what had happened is the people became very discouraged and distracted from doing the work that God wanted them to do. The temple sat in ruins for many years because of the opposition. But eventually the people just completely lost sight of why they were there, lost sight of the goal, and became so preoccupied with their own lives and building their own paneled houses that the temple was neglected. So what does all this mean for us? Well, the work that God has called us to do is slow and hard and can at times seem hopeless and even useless. And if we become hopeless about the work ever being finished, then we tend to kind of give up and just become very preoccupied with ourselves and turn our attention towards our own concerns and our own matters. Opposition can also discourage us and cause us to forget our mission. And we certainly are experiencing opposition today, and which seems to be growing. And so I think this is a very timely point to make, that the work God has called us to do is something that the world will oppose, that many will oppose and hate and try to stop. It's hard work. It requires sacrifice. It requires great risk as well. So do you recognize that? For your discussion, first thing would be, do you recognize that the mission Jesus has sent us on is hard? And would you say that the way you approach serving Christ reflects this and reflects the fact that you understand it's a hard call, that it's a hard calling and a difficult calling that He's placed on your life? Do you recognize that it may even make you unpopular with people around you, with maybe your neighbors, your friends, coworkers, your family members, and just with the culture in general is going to be opposed to it? Second, do you ever find yourself discouraged and start wondering, what's the point to all this anyways? Am I even making a difference? That certainly is something that hits me sometimes. And I think it's a kind of a normal thing. And certainly the people working on the city, rebuilding the temple felt this way. What's the point? Why bother rebuilding it when all it's going to do is invite all of this unwanted attention and all this opposition? And perhaps you're currently feeling like this. Maybe you're one of the ministry leaders in our church, and maybe you're one of the elders, the deacons, and you're wondering, am I even having an effect on the church? Is my work even making a difference? Is it even significant or noticeable, what I'm doing? That can be definitely something that the enemy would like to use to get you to stop doing the work. And also, how might the thrust of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah encourage you to continue the work of restoration and reform despite much opposition and obstacles? How might that encourage us to keep building and never give up and never look back and never stop? The work is hard. The work is opposed by many outside forces and people and so forth. But did Jesus ever say the work would be easy? He never did. The work he's called us to do is equivalent to taking our cross and following him. It cost Jesus everything. It cost his life. It cost all the comforts and joys of heaven that he surrendered in order to breathe the air and the dust like us. So this is all a reminder to us of the great difficulty of doing the work that God's called us to do. So I hope that this is helpful, and that as in your discussion time, there are some breakthroughs even in your own heart, maybe even being encouraged that much of how we feel is quite normal and just part of the process of bringing restorative and renewing grace to the world, and pronouncing and proclaiming the gospel of God's grace, which brings restoration. So that's all I have for today. So God bless you as you read his word.